Hi there, I'm Nicholas Griffin. This is History in 5, and I'm here to talk about 1971's ping-pong diplomacy and 5 things behind the history of the game that changed the world. The term ping-pong diplomacy was coined to describe the dramatic events in the spring of 1971, when after 22 years of silence, a sudden détente between the US and China was inspired by this group of American and Chinese ping-pong players. During the 1971 World Championships in Japan, the American team, seemingly out of the blue, was invited to play in Communist China. No American officials had entered China since the 1940s, and now, in April '71, a whole squad of table tennis players was being allowed in. The message was obviously political, but it was also rather innocuous, and that was very much China's intention. The novelty and the absurdity of the moment captured the world's imagination. Because ping-pong was mostly a recreational game in the US, it was a total surprise that the game had become so political in China. Chairman Mao had chosen it as the country's national sport in the early 1950s, not only because he liked to play, but also because the game happened to be run by a very eccentric Englishman. Ivor Montagu was the son of an English baron, the producer of early Alfred Hitchcock espionage films, and the founder of modern ping-pong, and he was also a communist spy in World War II. The game was supposedly invented by the British Army in the 1880s, and Montagu organized and codified it in the 1920s. He'd promoted the game among the working classes in England, who he thought as the ideal targets for what he actually theorized was a communist sport. He traveled the world in the interest of spreading the game internationally, but also used that as cover for his spying. In 1961, during the Great Leap Forward, in Chairman Mao's rush to industrialize the country, he abandoned the fundamentals of agriculture, and China suffered from an immense famine. When Ivor Montagu offered Beijing the chance to host the Table Tennis World Championships, Mao found a diversion he needed to convince the world that everything was okay. People were dying by the millions, yet the Chinese government was building the largest ping-pong stadium in the world, inviting in foreign teams and foreign journalists, and winning pretty much every match, all while the countryside withered out of the spotlight. The best Chinese players were catapulted into celebrity by their victory and became friendly with the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party. They were now a mixture of sports stars and political heroes. That was never more obvious than in 1971. The supposed spontaneous moment between the Chinese and the American table tennis players was actually entirely staged by the Premier of China in conjunction with China's best player, Chuang Tse-tung. The only ones who didn't know what were going on were the Americans. Chuang Tse-tung waved a young American player, Glenn Cowan, onto the Chinese bus during the World Championships, and he presented him with a traditional Chinese gift, a silk screen portrait, and engaged him in conversation to the absolute astonishment of onlookers. There soon followed an invitation for the American squad to leave for China immediately. Chuang Tse-tung was an old pro. He was a personal friend of the Chinese premier, and he claims he kept in contact with Chairman Mao by phone during those championships. Cowan looked like a hippie, he behaved like a hustler, and immediately saw that he could become the face of table tennis in the US, where the game had almost no presence. Both star players would suffer greatly. Cowan sunk everything into table tennis, but the game never took off. He ended up impoverished and died young. Chuang Tse-tung would be rewarded for his role in ping-pong diplomacy by being made a member of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party. But he'd fall from favor, he'd get thrown into prison. When he was released, he became a street sweeper and never recovered any kind of power. But it could have been worse. 3 of his teammates were either murdered or driven to suicide. Ping-pong helped end the Cold War. There was no contact between Communist China and the US until 1971's ping-pong diplomacy. The ping-pong exhibition came about thanks to calculated political will, but political will means nothing if it's not accompanied by the support of the citizens. Ping-pong immediately humanized both sides to one another. Within a month in 1971, a poll revealed that most Americans wanted to include China in the UN, something they'd been adamantly against for decades. It also weakened the Soviet position. The new Chinese-American friendship really worried the Kremlin, and they were forced into much warmer behavior towards both the US and China. The relationship between the US and China becomes more and more vital with every passing year. This book takes a close look at that very first step to show that the Chinese deserve our utmost respect as diplomats. They took a game as peculiar as ping-pong and used it as propaganda to help secure the change they wanted in the world. It was in our favor as well, but the timing, the location, and the method of contact were all chosen by the Chinese.